No, thank you, Simon, for inviting me, Rod, for inviting me to speak here today. I was at this Phys conference, which was really a terrific event the last 2 days, and I gave 2 lectures there on fructose, and I was told that I should give a slightly different talk, or a different talk today, because many of you may have heard me. So I'm going to talk about the fat switch, and it relates to both the book I wrote called The Fat Switch, but also to our work trying to identify a biologic process that could be responsible for turning on and off the process of becoming obese. So just as a reminder to what we all know is that we are in a major epidemic, not just of obesity, but of diabetes, high blood pressure, chronic kidney disease, fatty liver disease. And these epidemics are absolutely driving heart disease, cardiovascular mortality, and making public health a major issue. We have 47, I heard yesterday that 47% of Samoans are now diabetic, making them the highest rate of diabetes in the world. There are other countries with diabetes rates in the 20s, Kuwait, for example. And, you know, at one point in 1900, diabetes was seen in only 2 in 100,000 people. There would only be 20 diabetics in Auckland based on that rate, 80 in all of New Zealand. So you can see how things have changed. Obesity in 1900 only affected 3% of our population of adults in the US. Now it's over 30%. So we really have to do something. We have to figure out how to deal with this. Now, one of the sad things is that we've been aware of this for at least 40, 50 years, this increasing rates of obesity and diabetes. And there's been huge approaches, multiple studies trying to figure out what's causing it, but the epidemic continues. And so we begin to worry that our future may be like in the movie WALL-E, where everybody is going to be fat, the babies are going to be fat, everyone's going to be sitting on recliners and having the food served to them, and it's not really what we want. So the classic approach in medicine to try to solve problems such as these has been the classic approach of physiology, molecular biology, and genetics. And as you can, if you look into the literature and you try to look at, you know, how people have been trying to identify the causes, these are 3 of the major mechanisms. I think we can also put in the whole field of epidemiology probably as a 4th pillar. But these are basically the classical approaches to trying to figure out the cause of disease. But a number of years ago, Stephen Benner, who's a kind of a brilliant, insightful person, wrote a paper in Science and said that actually maybe we should be using additional approaches to crack disease that not only includes molecular biology, physiology, genetics, epidemiology, clinical research, but also includes comparative physiology, anthropology, paleontology, history, literature, and even at the center, evolutionary biology. And so today I'm going to try to revisit what obesity is from a planetary biology viewpoint. So at the very basis of this is the fact that is basically the concept of evolution, which Darwin can really be credited for. And by the way, his book, when it came out on November 24th, 1859, it sold out within 1 day. And so, you know, the lay public were actually quite interested in the science just as much as the scientists were. And he wrote that it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. And one of the things that animals have to do is they have to be able to survive during periods of food shortage. They have to be able to figure out ways to store food and water when it's not available. So all animals have tried to develop systems for protecting themselves against famine. Some of them store food and but many of them have learned that it's better to be able to learn how to increase your fat stores as a protective mechanism. So I would say that it's not just survival of the fittest, but it might even be viewed that one of the key things is for animals to figure out how they can store fat in times of famine. And the emperor penguin is a great example. The emperor penguin, as you probably know, lives in the Antarctic, and the male and female penguin will, the male penguin will actually be the primary penguin nesting, and they will move in on the ice, and they will kind of hold the egg between themselves, and they can go for periods of 4 months without eating during that entire time, and to survive, they will burn the fat that they've stored. And one of the interesting things about these penguins is the male penguin is the one that nests because he can store more fat. He's bigger and he can get more fat, so he can last longer. But if they run out of the fat, they actually have to abandon the egg and go to the sea to try to get more food. The concept that animals have learned how to become obese to survive is actually well known. And they're great examples. The long-distance migrating birds, like the migrating godwit, this bird has been known to fly 11,000 kilometers without food. It's got the world record. And so they have to actually store their bodies. They become hypertriglyceridemic. They fill their livers with fat. The African lungfish is a really interesting animal. This fish lives in freshwater lakes in Africa. And during droughts, the water can completely dry up, and the lungfish has to burrow into the mud. It covers itself with slime, and it lives off fat and water that it stores in itself. And it releases the water when it degrades the fat, what we call metabolic water. And it's been known to survive for 2 years in the mud. And then when the first rain comes back, it comes back out. This water-holding frog is from Australia, the Great Sandy Deserts of Australia, where it's been known to store huge amounts of fat in its feet. And it was thought that this helped not only when the sand was hot, but it was a great place to store the fat. And they also retain huge amounts of water. And when there's a drought, they can burrow in the sand and not eat or drink. And there are some that have lived up to 5 years this way. And it totally correlates with how much fat they store. The ones that store the most fat are the ones that survive. So learning how to store fat for these periods of time is pretty important for the survival of these animals. In many cases, the obesity is scheduled. And we all know this from understanding what hibernating animals do. And this is the 13-line ground squirrel. It's a hibernating squirrel in our area. We actually study these guys. And these squirrels will basically, beginning in late summer, suddenly change their intake where they become hyperphagic. They start eating more than they should. They actually develop leptin resistance. They drop their metabolism even before they hibernate, and they start accumulating fat. And then when they hibernate, then they switch into a fat burning phase. So there's a fat accumulation phase, and then they switch to a fat burning phase. And there's some evidence that they actually do this a little bit before they drop their body temperature. Now, one of the things that's fascinating, which really isn't commented in the literature much, is that these animals not only store fat, but they become insulin resistant. And actually, they develop every feature of metabolic syndrome. I actually wrote a paper on this. But bears will become insulin resistant and store fat. They develop all the features. So what we call the metabolic syndrome, some people say it's pathophysiologic. It's not pathophysiologic. It's the normal process animals do to store fat. And in most animals, it's turned on by a set process that initiates it when they're trying to prepare for food shortage. Not only is it scheduled, but it's highly regulated. So for example, if you have a hibernating ground squirrel and you try to wake it up and get it to eat, it won't eat. Or maybe it'll eat just a tiny bit, but usually it won't eat anything, even though it hasn't eaten for months. And as I mentioned, they actually drop their metabolic rate before they go into torpor. The red jungle fowl won't eat food when it nests, and you can actually bring food up to it. But while it's nesting, it's in a burning fat phase. It doesn't want to eat. So it's like, it isn't just about food availability. It's actually they've programmed themselves to go into a fat burning mode, or they're programmed into going into a fat accumulating mode. Some of them will regulate their weight on demand. Like great example is the hummingbird, which during the day is drinking nectar, which is basically sugar water, and they get incredibly fat during the day. Believe it or not, their liver becomes creamy white. It's been said to be the fattest liver of all birds. And they also develop hypertriglyceridemia, and they actually get hyperglycemic. Their blood glucoses go up to 400 or 500. And then at night, they burn off the fat, their glucose falls, and if they burn too much, because they have such a high metabolic rate, they'll go into torpor at 3 or 4 in the morning where they drop their body temperature on demand. Insects are the same. So insects actually will react to change in temperature. Or if a rain is coming or something like that, they can actually drop their metabolic rate when they sense changes in temperature or barometric pressure. So when you look at it from this way, you say, actually, well, we have a different kind of, when we think about this obesity epidemic and this epidemic of insulin resistance that moves to diabetes, what's happened is we've engaged a process of this fat storage syndrome. And so we need to understand what's engaging that, why is it being activated, and why is it not being, what turns it on and off. So the classic thought is that we're obese because we're just being given too much food. We're being given too much, there's just too much food availability. It's a consequence of our great civilization that now we have food on the table all the time. We can go to the grocery stores. And as a consequence, we just keep eating and eating. But actually, this guy Kesey showed years ago that animals really regulate their weight very, very tightly under most conditions. And so the question is, why is it that we aren't regulating our weight like animals do? We also say, well, obesity is because, not just because we're eating too much, but we're exercising too little. We're in a situation where there's too much TV and internet and cars, and as a consequence, we're not exercising, so we're metabolizing less, so when we eat, we accumulate more fat. So when you looked at it from this way, obesity is thought to be from bad habits, and that it's really our culture and to blame. We're a victim of our own success. Now we have too much food. We have too many things that we can do that don't require exercise, and so it's just that. But what I've told you is that in most animals, weight is highly, highly regulated, and what we now know is that this process of regulation is driven by when animals become hyperphagic, or when they decide to eat more than they normally do, they actually become transiently leptin resistant. They become resistant to this hormone that regulates satiety. And when they try to accumulate fat, what they do is they reduce fat oxidation in their liver and other tissues so that they have a tendency to accumulate more fat. And that this then leads to a slight reduction in metabolic rate, while at the same time they're eating more fat. So if this is the case, then the question is, what is activating this fat switch, and do humans have regulated, are we dysregulated, are we different, are we engaged in the same process, but we just don't know? So the way we approached trying to solve this was actually to try to figure out, well, how can we turn on a fat switch? how can, if there is a fat switch that switches you from accumulating fat to burning fat, how can I find it? And I thought to myself, actually, you might want to do it not by studying obesity, but by studying starvation. And why? Because if you start starving an animal, at some point it's going to put out its alarm signal and say, hey, stop this. I need to put fat back on. So I was thinking there might be, the answer might not be in studying obesity, but in studying starvation. So I went to the literature. I didn't actually starve any animals. Okay? I love animals, okay? I really love animals. But I thought, there's a literature on this. So I decided to do vicarious research, which means, you read what other people's do, and then you just try to think about how it might apply to your question. And so I realized that actually when animals store, when they store fat, they're also storing starch, which in the human is glycogen. In mammals, it's glycogen. In plants, it's starch. And there's this beautiful data in the literature that shows that when you quit eating, there's an initial phase where you're burning glycogen, and then there's a phase where you burn fat, and when the fat gets low, you start breaking down your proteins in your muscle. And it's really interesting that animals, this fat burning phase, for the most part, is calm, a calm phase. Animals know that there's going to be times when they're burning their fat because that's what they store the fat for, because it becomes an energy source. And so actually the planned period is the glycogen and fat burning phase, and the alarm period is when they start breaking down their muscle. And actually, even studies that were done in humans in the 1920s where they were starving people, and for a while they were doing some studies in the 60s, George Cahill and others, they're basically, those first two phases are calm, and then you get this agitated phase, and actually in the protein breakdown phase, that's when the animals start making a lot of sounds. They start, there's a response, it's called the foraging response. And actually this is when the penguin leaves his nest, when the protein starts breaking down, that's when they go to the sea. And actually at that point, weight loss falls very, very rapidly on a daily basis, and you die pretty quickly. So the animals will die in this third phase. So I said, well, if the planned phase is what they want to do, they're not going to turn on their fat accumulating, whatever the switch is, it won't go on at that stage. But in the alarm phase, that's probably when we should look for the switch. And there are two substances that go up dramatically in the blood during the alarm phase. And one is cortisol, and one is uric acid. And they both go up very high. So I said, well, let me look at cortisol. So if you look at cortisol, what does excessive cortisol cause? Cushing syndrome. What is it associated with? Abdominal obesity, fatty liver, elevated triglycerides, insulin resistance, diabetes, hypertension. It fits, except one problem. Obese people don't have high cortisol levels. So although it looks like it's an alarm signal, it's not the one that seems to be used by us. There is this thought that there may be cortisol being made in the tissue levels, but this is still kind of experimental, and no one really understands that yet. But the other signal, uric acid, it goes up, and by gosh, it's associated with gout, which is associated with abdominal obesity, fatty liver, elevated triglycerides, insulin resistance, diabetes, and hypertension. And actually, uric acid is high in the metabolic syndrome, and it's high in a lot of people with obesity. So it actually becomes a bit of a candidate. So what do we know about uric acid? Well, uric acid is a nucleotide degradation product. So it's basically a degradation product of DNA, RNA, and ATP. And when you think about it, this would be kind of an alarm signal to the animal if its RNA and DNA are breaking down. And in fact, there's evidence in the literature that it's a bit of a Mayday signal, and that when uric acid starts forming, for example, like if you have a neonate in severe distress, uric acid levels can go up to over 10, and uric acid levels are pretty much associated with an alarm signal in the animal. And so I was thinking to myself, you know, maybe uric acid should be viewed as a Mayday signal by the animal as a crisis for survival, and then may lead to trying to hold on to fat and possibly even other things like water and nitrogen. So in the last, and I'm not going to take you through this, but in the last decade, there's been a huge amount of evidence that uric acid does have a major survival pathway. It's been shown to stimulate foraging. There was a beautiful study that showed that it actually stimulates, if you raise uric acid acutely in mice, they become agitated and they start moving around more. It's been shown to raise blood pressure. This is work from our group, and we actually had a paper in JAMA showing that if you lower uric acid in adolescents with hypertension, you can lower blood pressure. Interestingly, we think it's in the early phases of hypertension that it's most important. It's been shown by a group at MIT that it activates the immune system, and it's been shown to act as an antioxidant. And actually, recently, our group showed that it stimulates fat storage. And one of the ways we showed this is if we just put uric acid on liver cells, the liver cells start to accumulate fat. And when we went on and studied the mechanism, we found that it was activating the mitochondria and causing changes in various enzymes that led to both increased fat synthesis and a block in fat oxidation. So when we studied this, we said, oh my gosh, so if uric acid is involved in fat accumulation, and you know, how would it work as a switch? And kind of a really cool thing happened. We realized that when DNA breaks down, that there's a generation of a product called AMP. And AMP really can go two different routes. It can be metabolized by AMP Deaminase to form uric acid, or it can be engaged by AMP Kinase as a means to burn fat. And we realized that this could act as a switch. And so we started studying this, and we found that, and as you probably know, in diabetes and in obesity, AMP kinase is pretty low. That's why metformin, which is a stimulant for AMP kinase, is used to treat diabetes, and it's been found to help weight loss as well. So, but no one really understood what inhibits AMP kinase in obesity, and we realized that actually there could be a yin-yang where AMP might go one way or the other, and that might lead to a switch. And in fact, we then went on and we showed that if we overexpressed AMP in liver cells, they accumulated fat. If we silenced AMP, we could block fat production. If we activated AMPK, we got the opposite, you know, and AMPK silence did the opposite. And then we found that when we activated AMPD, we actually inhibited AMPK. And it was uric acid that was actually the inhibitor. So it was pretty cool that we have published this, the first couple papers on this. And we have a paper that's under review where we then looked at hibernating animals. And we found that AMPD gets activated in the summer in these hibernating squirrels, and they accumulate fat. And we've now recently shown that this stimulates gluconeogenesis too, so it's actually stimulating glucose production. And then when in winter, they switch over and they activate AMPK, and then they start burning the glucose and burning the fat. Now, the reason this is important for a low-carb conference is that the best stimulator of AMPD is fructose, which is in sugar. It is just a terrific way to activate the fat accumulation phase. So what activates the fat switch? Oh, here I go. I forgot that I was going to show this. So basically, what activates AMPD in humans? We believe sugar is the primary culprit, and in the U.S., high fructose corn syrup, and we think it's fructose that does it. Actually, we know fructose activates AMPD, and fructose does so by consuming ATP. It breaks down to AMP, and as intracellular phosphate falls, it activates this enzyme. And there's now 3 isoforms of AMPD, and we have the knockout mice, and we're doing some pretty interesting work trying to figure out how this AMPD regulates fat and sugar, glucose. And so When we give fructose to animals, we actually induce leptin resistance. They accumulate, they lose their ability to control their appetite, their activity falls, their fat mass goes up, they activate AMPD. If we block AMPD or we block uric acid, we slow this process, and if we actually if we increase uric acid, we accelerate the process. So we now think that fructose is a big player in the stimulation of weight gain, and that it may do so through this pathway. So do other animals use this pathway? Yes. This is the pacu fish. He lives in the Amazon. He is one of 150 different fruit-eating fish species. Did you know that some fish only eat fruit? How do they do that? Well, the way they do that is really cool. It turns out that during certain times of the year, the Amazon, there's heavy rains and the Amazon floods. And what begins as a river, the Amazon basically spreads for thousands of kilometers into the jungle. So it's like a big, orchard of what, where the trees are all underwater, like here. And basically these fish go in there, and the fruiting of the trees has been shown to correspond to this period of time. And they drop the fruit into the water, the fish eat the fruit, they disperse the seeds, and it's actually been shown to be an ecological niche where the fish are helping the trees. And then the fish become incredibly fat when they eat the fruit, and their fat content goes up like 40%. And then the floods retreat, and the fish survive for 6 months without eating, burning the fat in their liver and in their tissues. Bears do the same. They wait for the fall when the fruits are out, and then with the first frost, a lot of the sugar content goes up and the antioxidant content goes down. They eat huge amounts, and it's different from humans where we only eat small amounts of fruits. One scat, for example, is found to have 10,000 grapes in a 24-hour period. So these guys like engorge, and by eating so much sugar, they actually do get a pretty huge dose of fructose. And one of the things that we do is we tend to eat fruit in the early season when the vitamin C content's high and the sugar content's medium or low, and they wait till the fruits are kind of rotting, lush, and the kind that we don't generally like to eat when the sugar content's higher and the vitamin C content's lower. So I believe natural fruits in general are good. We actually did a low-carb, a low-fructose diet with or without fruit supplements, and the fruit supplements did not block the ability to improve the metabolic syndrome. And it's because fruits have much less sugar and because they have all these good things. But remember, if you make fruit juices, you can suddenly get a lot of dose of fructose in just a few minutes, and that's not good. So to summarize, when we go back, when we look at the rise in obesity, it does correlate with the increase in sugar. We do believe that the sugar is playing a role, that fructose is being directly activating this biologic switch. Animals use this biologic switch to become fat, and we are too. And so we should reduce our sugar. And one of the scary things, which I don't have time to talk about today, is that we have found that carbs themselves can be converted to fructose in the body under certain circumstances, and so that can drive insulin resistance and fatty liver. So I believe that at the heart of the carb problem is fructose, and it doesn't just come from the sugar you eat, it comes from the fructose you make. We have to figure out more about this, and it also correlates with diabetes. So to conclude, weight is highly regulated. To gain weight, animals activate processes that lead to fat storage. To find the fat switch, we reviewed the metabolic changes that occurred with starvation. These studies suggested that uric acid might be involved. Further studies showed that activation of AMP deaminase and generation of uric acid might be critical to driving the fat switch. Just to let you know, what other food does this? Beer. Beer will activate this switch. So beer becomes a great substrate. And so that, it's not sugar, but it will go through the same path. Fructose is a nutrient that specifically activates AMP deaminase, and the marked increase in fructose intake following the introduction of sugar and high fructose corn syrup likely has a major role in driving the obesity epidemic. Thank you very much.
I think Gerhard's here to grab you, so I'll let you off the hook.
Okay. I could take it.
Okay. Oh, thank you very much, Rick. It's fascinating to hear this information come from various different fields in science. Rick doesn't restrict himself to medicine only, but zoology and history. Has anyone got a quick couple of questions?
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rick.
Yes, we had a paper in Nature Communications a few months ago where we gave glucose to animals, and we could show that some of the glucose was being converted to fructose in the liver through the polyol pathway. And if we inhibited the polyol pathway or inhibited fructose metabolism, we could block the effects of carbs to induce fatty liver and insulin resistance. They still gained weight, but it was a metabolically healthy weight. So we think that the glucose insulin pathway does drive fat, but it's driving basically a kind of a healthy fat. But when you induce fructose, you actually induce this pathway to stimulate insulin resistance, diabetes, fat storage, and so forth. So we think the bad player is fructose.
Thank you very much, Rick.